Hello everyone, happy Friday once again. We're so happy to have you back. Tonight might very well be the night we finish the book of Nehemiah. If you were with us last week and were able to stay awake during the lengthy reading of the prayer in Nehemiah chapter 9, congratulations, I applaud you. And thanks for coming back. I've really enjoyed these studies, and I've learned a lot from the various commentaries and sources in putting these studies together. Hopefully it's been an interesting experience for you as well. One of the things I've been very slow to learn is the fact that I should never read lengthy sections of scriptures or texts in their entirety, including great prose like any or all of those three inspired all-time great prayers that we find in Daniel 9, Ezra 9, and Nehemiah 9. Those precious writings should be cherished and savored by the reader and the listener. My reading of those prayers in their entirety seemed to drag on, and I'm sure the presentation detracted from the inspiring content. Still, the content of that prayer in Nehemiah 9 was essential to the subject of the entire book, and it really needed to be read. But I'm sure I could have somehow made the reading more interesting. So I hope to do better, and I'll strive to make these studies more interesting. Now, with that being said, class dismissed. No, I'm just teasing. Okay, we're beginning the third and final section or division in the book of Nehemiah. If at all possible, follow along in your Bible and make some notes whenever you need to. Some of these numbers and factoids are a little hard to follow by just listening in. Last week, we covered the National Day of Fasting and Prayer, which they did just 2 days after the Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths. And it's probably safe to assume that nearly everyone participated in the public prayer and official agreement or covenant that was made with God, in which they all committed to obey the law of God. It was signed and sealed and agreed to by everyone old enough to understand what was going on. So this week, we learn about the resettlement of Jerusalem within the walls as well as the areas outside of the walled city. The city needed to be more populated in order to maintain a vibrant economy, as well as house those who had an integral part of the civil government and priesthood. Additionally, it was vital to have more people there in case they were ever attacked. If that were ever the case, they really couldn't afford to be short-handed. The city of Jerusalem had pretty much been a ghost town during the 70 years of captivity, but the population had been growing in the past 35 years, when the first exiles began to return with Zerubbabel, and then later with Ezra. But now the walls were completed, the city needed to be built up and resettled. The first few verses pretty much set the stage for what was going on in the next couple of chapters, so let's read them. Nehemiah 11:1. Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 to them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. Verse 2, the people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Most translations say the people blessed all the people who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. And now verse 2 makes it sound, and probably rightly so, that not everyone necessarily wanted to move to the city. And I can understand that. Lots of people would prefer living out in the country on their own farms or ranches, raising livestock, growing crops, and raising their families in a rural environment. But there might have been a trade-off. Life is always a trade-off, isn't it? Those in the city would have the wall to protect them from invaders, and that would be a good thing. They would also have immediate access to whatever was going on in or around the temple, and that would be an essential part of worship, and that would be a good thing. there would probably be availability to higher education and possibly more ways to serve ecclesiastically or in the local government. At some point, there might be more economic opportunities in the city as well, as there would be a need for merchants of all sorts. But that could take some time. David Guzik's enduring word commentary shed some light on living in Jerusalem at that time. To live in Jerusalem, this is a quote, to live in Jerusalem you had to reorder your view of material things. You had to give up land in your previous region and take up some kind of new business in Jerusalem. To live in Jerusalem you had to rearrange your social priorities, certainly leaving some friends and family behind in your old village. To live in Jerusalem you had to have a mind to endure the problems in the city. It had been a ghost town for 70 years, and now basically a slightly rebuilt, somewhat repopulated ghost town. The city didn't look all that glorious, and it needed work. To live in Jerusalem, you had to live knowing you were a target for the enemy. There were strong walls to protect you, but since Jerusalem was now a notable city with rebuilt walls, the fear was more from whole armies than just bands of robbers. The old village was nice, but not much danger from great armies. End quote. Now, beginning in verse 4, once again we see an example of the detailed accounting of the newly resettled citizens. Chapters 11 and 12 are a precise registry of those who settled within Jerusalem and those who settled outside of Jerusalem. And we might ask, why is it necessary to include all this information in the Holy Scriptures? Well, it's very purposeful. Derek Kidner, writer for the Ezra and Nehemiah section of the Tyndale Old Testament commentaries, aptly says this, quote, "It's not bureaucratic pedantry that has preserved these names. The point is, once more, that these people and their chronicler are conscious of their roots and their structure of God's company. This is no rabble of refugees settling down anywhere. They have the dignity of order and of known relationships. Above all, of their calling to be, quote, a kingdom of priests and holy nation, end quote." That's in Exodus 19:6. And that's the end of David Kidner's quote. Well, let's go to Exodus and read that. Chapter 19 of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 6. Let's start in verse 5 of Exodus 19. "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." End quote. These people have just agreed to fully obey God and keep his covenant. They were, in fact, a kingdom of priests, and God looked upon them as being holy. We won't read through all the verses in chapters 11 and 12, but here's a basic outline of how and where the people were resettled. Chapter 11, verses 3 through 24, lists all the people who resettled in Jerusalem. Verses 3 through 9 list the leaders who settled in Jerusalem, and the NIV, New International Version, calls them provincial leaders, which could mean leaders of the provinces outside of Jerusalem. The King James Version refers to them as the chief of the province. And the Hebrew word for province there is Medinah, and it means a judgeship or a district ruled by a judge. Verses 10 through 14 of chapter 11 list the priests who resettled in Jerusalem. Verses 15 to 24 lists the Levites, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants who resettled in Jerusalem. So those were the people who lived within the walled city of Jerusalem, and that registry is like a who's who in Jerusalem. By the looks of it, not just anyone could live there. I gather you had to meet one of the above requirements before you could live in the city. Nehemiah included the numbers of the people there, and here are the population totals according to the Barnes commentary. If you're just listening and not taking notes or following along in your Bible, it might be kind of hard to follow these population numbers of the individual tribes, but try to follow. Mainly the grand total of people who were resettled there is the number you may want to keep in mind. According to Nehemiah's numbers, the total number of males was 3,044. But he leaves out 690 descendants of Judah who are listed in 1 Chronicles 9:6 as living in Jerusalem. When you add the 690 descendants from the line of Perez, and Perez was the son of Judah, the entire adult population of the city became 3,734. Then Barnes extrapolates that number and comes up with a total population of 14,936, which would include women and children. But when you supplement the total number of males in 1 Chronicles 9 with Nehemiah's numbers, the adult males totaled 4,370. And from that figure, Barnes extrapolates the entire population to have been 17,480. Then you have to consider the number of people who were there as a result of the lots being cast, 1 out of every 10. So the total population could have been close to 20,000. And that's probably the number you need to keep in mind for whatever reason. And that's according to the Barnes commentary, and those numbers might be a bit confusing and hard to follow. But like I said, it's helpful to know that the approximate population was around 20,000. After listing and numbering the people living inside the city, Nehemiah lists the families who settled the areas outside of the city, beginning in verses 25 through 36 of chapter 11. In verses 1 through 11 of chapter 12, it's recorded that the priests, the high priests, and the Levites of Zerubbabel's era were settled in the areas outside of the city. Verses 12 through 26 of chapter 12 tells us the priests and the Levites of Nehemiah's era, who weren't living in Jerusalem, were settled in the towns of Judah and Benjamin. And that brings us to verse 27 of chapter 12. Go ahead and turn there if you're not following along already. Nehemiah is organizing the dedication of the wall. He's bringing everyone who needs to be there who are living in the outlying towns and villages. This was something Nehemiah was probably working on and organizing behind the scenes while the others were building their homes and settling into their new locations. If you've got a good map of Nehemiah's wall, have it handy and it'll be a good visual tool as we read through this chapter. And if you don't have a map handy, just hit the pause button and search for a map of Nehemiah's wall. All you need to do is enter the phrase, "Images of Nehemiah's wall around Jerusalem." Just enter that into your favorite search engine. Bunches of the maps or pictures, they're going to pop up and they're not all going to be the same. Google works fine for this, and so does Bing.com. Just don your Berean hat and pick one of the maps that you think is the most accurate for this time period. Look at a lot of them to get a good comparison. Then, if you find one you like, just print it out so you'll have it. The remainder of Nehemiah's book, which is a journal really and a bit disjointed in places, but I'm sure it's safe to assume Nehemiah conveyed to the reader everything he needed to convey to the reader. It was inspired, after all. But as I started to say, the remaining content of the book, it's fascinating on a couple of levels. As we begin reading about the dedication, we logically assume it was taking place very shortly after the completion of the wall, the fall feast days and their national day of prayer and fasting. Let's begin reading in about verse 27, but first, why don't we just take a short break?
What do you do when life has dealt you a bad hand? Where do you turn when everything seems to have turned against you? Write for a free CD of a message entitled Beyond Adversity. Learn what lies on the other side of adversity. Write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791, or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
Okay, we're back. Chapter 12, verse 27. Nehemiah 12:27. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The musicians also were brought together from the region around Jerusalem, from the villages of the NEH8, from Beth Gilgal, and from the area of Geba and Asmaveth, for the musicians had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates, and the wall. Well, how did the priests and Levites actually purify the people? And how did they go about purifying the gates and the wall? Well, Ezra 6:20 gives us some insight on purification, and here's what it says. Quote, "The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were all ceremonial clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. And yes, that was for Passover, but sacrifices were always necessary for purification." And regarding the walls and the gates, the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges says this, quote, "The people were purified in order that they might engage in the solemn dedication of their city walls without violation of the laws of purity. The gates and walls were probably sprinkled, with blood that is, both as a sign of the dedication and to remove defilement from the path of the sacred procession." Verse 31. "I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed to the top of the wall to the right toward the dung gate." And then Nehemiah names some of the individuals who were in the procession. Let's skip down to the last part of verse 36. Verse 36, the last part. "Ezra, the teacher of the law, led the procession. At the fountain gate, they continued directly up the steps of the city of David, on the ascent to the wall, and passed above the site of David's palace to the water gate on the east. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the tower of the ovens to the broad wall, over the gate of Ephraim and Jeshanah, and the Jeshanah gate, the fish gate, the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100, as far as the sheep gate. At the gate of the guard they stopped. The 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half of the officials, as well as the priests," and then it lists their names, "with their trumpets. And in verse 42, the choirs sang under the direction of Jezrahiah." Verse 43, "On that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away." So if you've been keeping up with the story up to now, it seems logical and obvious that the dedication took place not long after the completion of the wall, the Feast of Tabernacles, and their national day of prayer and fasting, and I mentioned that earlier. But there's some disagreement among some commentaries as to when this dedication ceremony actually took place. At least 2 commentaries believe this dedication happened a full 12 years after the wall was completed. Really? Yes, really. You'll recall that Nehemiah went to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall in the 20th year of King Darius, the great Artaxerxes. And it was completed in a phenomenal 52 days. Then, in chapter 7, he turned control of the city over to his brother Hanani and to Hananiah. Though it's not stated as such, it was at this time Nehemiah headed back to Shushan to meet with King Darius. And it was still during the 20th year of the king's reign. Nehemiah didn't stay in Shushan very long because the king made him the governor of Judea in that 20th year. So Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem and stayed there for 12 years. It's my opinion, for what it's worth, that they observed the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of Tabernacles, then had their national day of prayer and fasting, and then signed the covenant they made with God. In the first year or so after Nehemiah's 12-year stay, or not after the 12-year stay, but in the first year or so of Nehemiah's 12-year stay in Jerusalem. Next came the resettlement in and around Jerusalem, and when everyone was mostly settled into their homes and jobs, Nehemiah organized the dedication of the wall. That was a time of jubilation and obedience to God because of the commitment they had all made to God regarding the sin of intermarriage. Spiritually, they were right on target, living the life that God wanted them to live as residents of His holy city. Wouldn't that have been the time to dedicate the wall? Well, you'd think so. If there was a lengthy delay of 12 years, what was that all about, and what proof does anyone offer to bolster that opinion? Well, we'll need to skip ahead to chapter 13, verse 6, to see what's going on. And this is where things are a little disjointed. Let's go there and read it. Verse 6 of chapter 13, and here's what it says. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. So before we look at a couple of the commentaries, we need to ask what he means when he says, but while all this was going on. All what was going on? What's he referring to? Well, we need to read the preceding verses, so let's pick up where we were in chapter 12 and reread verse 43 where we left off. Nehemiah 12:43. And on that day, the day of the dedication, they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. Verse 44. At that time, what time? Well, in that same general time frame, shortly after the dedication. At that time, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites, for Judah was pleased with the ministering of priests and Levites. Verse 45. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, and did also musicians and gatekeepers according to the commands of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there had been directors for the musicians and for the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel contributed to the daily portions for the musicians and the gatekeepers. They also set the portion for the other Levites, and the Levites set aside the portion for the descendants of Aaron. So up to now, as I read it, we're in the time frame shortly after the dedication, and well within the 12-year period of time before Nehemiah returns to Shushan in the 32nd year of the king's reign. So that's the end of chapter 12, and let's try to figure out the time frame of chapter 13. Nehemiah 13, and let's read the first 3 verses. Verse 1, on that day, what day? When is this? Well, let's read on. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call down a curse on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. Verse 3, when the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Okay, make note of the next 2 verses, verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, before this, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. You remember Tobiah, right? And verse 5, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and the temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. Now, when it says before this in verse 4, I think that refers back to the first verse of this chapter where it says in Nehemiah 13:1, on that day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God. Got that? I know it's a little confusing, but let me read verse 5 the way I interpret it, and maybe it'll make more sense. Here's verse 5 as I understand it. Before the day the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. And he had provided him a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. Now that might be a little hard to follow, but if we can get a handle on the flow of events, I think it makes it easier to understand what's going on. So now let's go to the next verse, verse 6, and then see 2 of the commentaries, what they say about the time of dedication. Verse 6, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. Some time later I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Now, here's what the Barnes commentary says about this dedication, about the dedication based on this verse and this verse alone. The dedication of the wall. The ceremony had been deferred for the space of nearly 12 years. Nehemiah 13:6. Perhaps Nehemiah required an express permission from the Persian king before he could venture on a solemnity which might have been liable to misrepresentation. Now, the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges states virtually the same thing as Barnes without giving any further reason or substantiation of why it would have been 12 years later. And the only scripture they use is Nehemiah 13:6. So, I don't think that proves their point at all. Now let's pick up the last part of verse 7. It's when Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem, and we don't know exactly how long he's been gone. Nehemiah 13:7. This is the last part of the verse. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the court of the courts of the house of God. So Tobiah finally wormed his way into the courts of the temple while Nehemiah was gone. And he was able to do that because of the sinful intermarriage of the nobles with the surrounding foreigners. Verse 8, I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of his room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and I stationed them at their posts. Verse 12, all Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. And I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and I made Hanan, son of Zachar, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to the fellow Levites. Verse 14, remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. So Nehemiah prayed. I'm sure Nehemiah can't believe what he's seeing. Those who knew better had rapidly slipped back into their former sins while he was gone. We have to assume Ezra had died because he never would have let the people degenerate like this. You remember how he reacted when he first came to Jerusalem during Zerubbabel's era. You can go back and see his reaction in Ezra 9:3, and to say that he was upset would be a gross understatement. You remember how he reacted when he first came to Jerusalem during the Zerubbabel era. You can go back and see what his reaction was in Ezra 9:3, and to say he was upset would be a gross understatement. In verse 13, just a few verses back, it speaks of Zadok as being the scribe instead of Ezra. So he must have died, even though we're not explicitly told that. Nehemiah further explains how the culture has deteriorated as we read on. The next 8 verses explain how the observance of the Sabbath needed to be restored. Nehemiah 13:15. In those days I saw the people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. Verse 17, I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Verse 20. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Verse 22. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show me mercy according to your great love. Now the next 7 verses deal with the same problems they've had to deal with twice before, back in Ezra 9 and 10, and back when they held their national day of prayer and fasting. That was the sin of intermarriage with foreigners of pagan religions. Verse 23, Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called down curses on them. I beat some of the men, and I pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like this that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Verse 27. Must we hear now that you are all doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God. And so, the book of Nehemiah doesn't end as merrily as we might have hoped. Wouldn't it have been great if the story ended at the triumphal dedication ceremonies? It would have had a storybook ending. But, like storybook endings, what-ifs are for make-believe. We don't know how long Nehemiah was gone, but by the time he returned, Jerusalem and the surrounding areas had slid into spiritual permissiveness. Since Ezra was no longer around, maybe the existing leaders weren't firmly based in God's law, and they must have gone down the slippery slope of spiritual decay, just like the general population. Stephen Cole at Bible.org states that, to deal with spiritual permissiveness, we must be aware of the problem areas, and we must strongly confront them. End quote. And Nehemiah did just that. A lesser man might have just tossed up his hands, given up, and announced to God that these people are just hopeless, and I'm going back to serve the king. But Nehemiah knew that he was serving the king of the universe. And it's interesting to note that the last sentence of Nehemiah's book is a prayer. The lessons to be learned from this book are many. Lessons of prayer and fasting, lessons of leadership, lessons of teamwork, lessons of organization, lessons of courage, and so many more. As we finish up this study and go online, we will have just completed the observance of the New Testament Passover and the days of unleavened bread. These days picture our redemption by way of the willing sacrifice of Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb. The days of unleavened bread picture the de-leavening of our lives, that is, putting sin out of our lives and living to the best of our ability to keep sin out of our lives. Of all the lessons we might learn from this book, maybe the most important one we can learn is to not allow sin to creep back into our lives like it did for those in Judea. The people of Nehemiah's time slipped back into sin, and maybe it was because they didn't have the Holy Spirit to help them. But we do have the Holy Spirit to help us. Thus ends this study on the book of Nehemiah. Go back and study it on your own when you get a chance. The second Temple era is really rich with history and really interesting. I'm going on a short hiatus for the next month or two, but when I come back, we're going to study the fascinating book of Esther. It should be interesting. Well, take good care of yourselves, my friends, and have a wonderful weekend. Good night, everyone.